So yeah, going from Stephen's amazing talk on moths, I'm now going to talk about a species that likes devouring moths, and actually seems to take absolute pleasure in it too. Cuckoos, yeah. So something I've obviously been fascinated about cuckoos forever, and it's something that I was really keen to try and get much more information on about our Irish birds. So where do they go? The cuckoo, or cuach, has a amazing sort of long history in Ireland as a harbinger of summer. So whereas a lot of species are spring orientated, cuckoo is much more about summer. They're a lot later arriving, and they actually leave very early too. So as you can see there, they only arrive usually at the very end of April, around about now. And then start leaving. The adults start leaving as early as, June, and some may still linger on into early July. And they lay eggs in other birds' nests as well, which is quite unusual. It's the only species that does that in Ireland, although there are quite a few other species of cuckoo around the world that do similar things, and have no involvement whatsoever in raising the young. And I can see a lot of parents out there thinking, if only. There we go. So cuckoo hosts. So this is quite interesting. So in Ireland, most of our cuckoos are reared through meadow pipits. Meadow pipits are the main hosts that our cuckoos lay their eggs in. But they have been known from a few other species as well. In fact, across Europe, there's over 100 species that have been recorded having cuckoos lay their eggs in. And there's a very interesting dynamic where cuckoos lay their eggs, the chick hatches, and their eggs are actually, when they're laid, are mimics of the other birds. So they look almost identical to the other bird's eggs. And when those hatch, the chicks actually will push out any eggs or chicks of the other birds from the nests. So it's amazing. This naked, one-day-old chick will be pushing all these other things out of the nest, which is quite amazing. There's a couple of videos out there which you can look at, which are just quite amazing. And then you get this really weird sort of situation of this, what seems like a very small adult feeding a massive chick. And I think sort of the adults, just as soon as they start feeding it, it's their chick. They'll keep going until it's fully grown and fledged. And there's quite a really interesting dynamic with the female cuckoos as well. Is that they will, whatever species that they are hatched from. So if it's a meadow pipit that they were fledged from, they will only ever lay in a meadow pipit nest. So it's really important for those individuals that the same species is still around. And that's one of the biggest conservation issues that we worry about, because meadow pipit is now on the red list. It's starting to sort of dramatically decline. So there's lots of these things that, there's lots of bits and pieces that go around finding out what's going on with these birds. Ooh. So the project that we embarked on was basically tracking cuckoos. So we wanted to find out where they were going, what they were doing, how long they were spending in certain areas. And there was an amazing project that was started by the British Trust for Ornithology back in 2011. And they really pioneered this project on this species and this type of tag. And this tag, it's quite amazing. It's only about 5 grams. And it's got a little set of solar panels on the back, which keeps the battery going. And this satellite tracking device basically lives the whole life of the bird. So whereas a lot of them actually will, sort of die off within the tags, will sort of die off within a few months or a year or so. These will basically stay with these birds for life. So we'll get to understand sort of multiple journeys of each individual of what they're doing, as long as obviously as long as the life of the bird. And they started this project in the UK, mainly looking at their migration and what they were doing, and they've started going into a much more big tangent since then. But since 2011, they had tagged 100 cuckoos in Britain, And so we managed to get in on the game last year, and starting to find out a bit more about what's going on with our Irish cuckoos. And basically the migration with a species like this would actually spend so little time here and spends far more of its time elsewhere. It's really obvious that, well, potentially obvious that the time it's spending elsewhere could be critical to what's going on with its conservation. So in May last year, myself and a few other members from the BTO came over and tried to catch some cuckoos. And we basically, within 2 days, we managed to catch all the cuckoos we needed, to be honest. It was actually happened a lot quicker than we were expecting. But it did involve some seriously early morning and some seriously large amounts of midges. It was really quite an experience, if you can call it that. But yeah, so it was a very simple setup of setting up a series of nets, and we had a decoy female cuckoo, and we played a cuckoo call before it would start, just before it got light, and we managed to catch the cuckoos. So as you can see there, this first picture here is up in Killarney National Park, and then the second picture is in the Burren. So the 4 cuckoos we managed to tag were Karen, who was in the Burren National Park, and then 3 from Killarney, Cause, KP, and Talk. And most of those, you can tell, are named after hills or whatever within the area that they were caught, and was it was really quite exciting for me. It was something new to learn, new to understand. The tagging process is very, very full. It was quite an experience to be involved in. Some very, very experienced people doing it, and great to see them go off. So I'll start with the bad news. Unfortunately, our one bird from the Burren, Karen. What was quite interesting about this bird was that we actually could tell that this was a second-year bird, so it had obviously been to Africa and back once. We could tell that because you could see the different. It still had some juvenile feathers in its wings, so we knew it had been hatched the year before. And as you can see, stayed in its very local area quite a lot, but then by the 20th of June, it basically stopped transmitting. And by the transmitter, it also is able to take temperature readings, and the battery, and it basically gives us a bit of we can also tell what the battery life is like, and we could see that the battery was dropping down really, sort of steadily over a course of time, and the temperature was dropping down steadily over a course of time, and that pretty much tells us that bird is dying. The battery life, it obviously was lying somewhere. If the temperature was still high, it would mean that the bird, because it's attached to the bird, you'd still have the temperature of the bird coming in. So unfortunately for this bird, it didn't survive very long after tagging. But that's the nature of nature of this. So some birds won't survive as long as we hope them to, and others will survive for years and years. So we don't know what exactly we are. We did try and find the remains of Karen, but we couldn't find her, unfortunately. So whereas our Kerry birds were much better. So the 3 Killarney birds, they spent a lot of time, again, all around the same sort of area, the higher points around Tork, Insheens. They pretty much stayed in that entire area on the south side of the national park, didn't move very far at all, which was straight away was quite interesting for us. We weren't sure if they'd be moving around more in the breeding season. That they're not tied to a nest, so do they have one territory, or do they move and have other territories elsewhere, or so it was still first information, which is quite exciting. And then so they were there for about 3 weeks, and then on the 3rd of June, all things started to change. So Cause was the first one to move, in the yellow there. Dashed off down to Ballincollig, was there literally, a night, and then shot up north, up towards Limerick, and was there for a little while. While Torque moved across to Clonmel, near Tipperary, spent a bit of time there, and a lot later, so he'd spent a lot more. KP spent a lot more time around Killarney, left a lot later, and on the 26th, shot over to Ballinhooly in Cork as well. And where they went from there, we weren't sure. So this was the first big sort of unknown as to what they might do. So, for example, all the UK cuckoos just went straight down between the UK and France, but our Irish cuckoos are really, we're a bit further out west, especially out here. Are they going to use Britain as well as a stop-off point, or will they just go straight down to France, or maybe even further, straight down to Spain? Who knows? We didn't know what was going to happen. I thought they might skip over Britain, getting lots of food and everything here. Why would you make another stop? And that pretty much seemed to bear out. So Cause did a very brief overnight in Wales, and then went straight down into northwest France. Torque basically, I think pretty much used Cornwall as a bit of a space to get a bit of thermals just to keep his flight going. And then, as you can see there, KP just did this straight beeline over one day, straight down towards the Swiss border, which was quite amazing. Starting to get these very quick movements for quite a large bird, quite a heavy bird, and trying to sort of move through the landscape, making those two big crossings of water crossings like that, just very straight through. So that was the first sort of, we're starting to understand a little bit of what they might do on their southbound journey. And it was at this point that they joined up, because at the same time, there was a number of cuckoos also tagged in Britain. And as you can see, they then started to sort of join up with some of them. And actually, our Irish birds left way before any of the British birds started moving, which was also something quite interesting. Maybe because they're that bit further west, they've got a bit more movement they've got to do. But obviously this is still a relatively small sample, so might not be indicative of what happens all the time, but certainly gives us a bit of a suggestion. So as I say, they move down, and you can see this area of northern Italy down here is a really important, the BTO had already worked out this is a really, really important refueling point. It's the Po Valley, which is just just out of the Alps into northern Italy, and it's a really, really important fueling up point. And they spent, so both Cause and KP ended up coming down into that area. But as you can see there, Torque went a bit further afield, and actually spent all his time in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is first, in those 100 birds that the BTO have done, this was the first bird to spend its refueling point there, which was quite unusual as well. And when you think that was actually about as far east as any of the BTO, but the tag birds have ever gone. So going from as far west as possible to as far east as possible was a little bit unexpected. They thought they'd pretty much, sort of stick to the same, if anything, maybe even go a little bit more westward. But they're certainly still doing something different. And that fueling up is really important. So this is they spend about 8 weeks fueling up in that part of the Mediterranean, to then, before then their big next challenge, which is crossing the Sahara. So KP and Torque was pretty straightforward compared to what the others had done over previous years, and so they did almost a direct straight crossing all the way down through the Sahara, and that basically only took them a couple of days from leaving northern Italy. Certainly to get to the southern edge, it took them a couple of days. KP spent, what is it? Yeah. KP spent about another 3 or 4 weeks down here. There's basically quite a large oasis down on the edge of the Sahara down here. And he spent quite a bit of time there before finally making the last move down. Whereas Talk went all the way through and basically just into the green there, just into the equatorial part of Africa pretty quickly. But as you see there, he went even further east, ended up going down through Greece before coming all the way down. Whereas Cause was quite different. This was something quite unexpected. So after spending 8 weeks in the Po Valley, he suddenly completely retraced his steps and started coming back northwest and ended up back in near the Loire again, before then completely going off east and spending near to the Swiss border, and then ended up down in Bordeaux. And this became a little bit of a joke because this was obviously exactly the same time as the World Cup was going on. And he then spent another 8 weeks around Bordeaux. And to be honest, we thought that this was probably a really bad sign. So what is most likely happened is, whilst in the Po Valley, he wasn't finding enough food, wasn't building up his energy resources properly, wasn't building up his fat and muscle reserves, wasn't ready to go. So he was looking for somewhere else to refuel. And it's obviously getting quite late in the season for that to happen. They as I said before, they literally in Europe, they pretty much only feed on hairy caterpillars. So that's it. That's what they are feeding on. Their diet changes slightly, a bit differently in Africa, but in Europe, they pretty much exclusively hairy caterpillars. So they have to find the right places for that right food and enough of it so that they can keep going. So after 8 weeks in, pretty much another 8 weeks in Bordeaux, thankfully, he then did another big jump in early October. And that was literally within 2 days, he left Bordeaux and ended up right down sort of in the south of the Sahara, which was really quite amazing. We really thought this was the end. There was 2 other of last year's cuckoos from Britain that did something similar, and they both died, but Cause continued, which is really exciting. So it really shows that they are able to readjust, are able to do something different. And as you see, his crossing went quite differently as well. So a lot further west, and actually ended up going over a lot larger distance of of the Sahara. So whereas most of them, they either go the eastern route, which around sort of Egypt, Libya, or they go the western route. Whereas ours all went down the eastern route. So eventually, by November, he eventually finding himself back, in the Congo Basin. So the Congo Basin is where they basically spend most of their time. So cuckoos, they spend about 4 months in the Congo Basin over the winter, just chilling out, refueling, eating, not doing very much more else. And it's all within this amazing sort of landscape of equatorial forest. And there's pretty much where there's virtually no people, which is part of the reason why we had absolutely no idea where our cuckoos went, neither in Britain or here until they started the satellite tracking. There was one recovery of a ringed cuckoo from the Cameroon back in 1936, and that was it. That was the only cuckoo ever to be found, so ringed cuckoo ever to be found in Africa. So yeah, it was a complete unknown. We sort of knew they went to Africa, but whereabouts or whatever, not sure at all. So they basically spent almost their whole time in the DRC and the Republic of Congo, in that area there. A few sort of skip over towards Angola a little bit on a bit further on the west coast. But it's all in that same habitat, all in that sort of dense rainforest, in the exact same areas where you have the highest concentration of mountain gorilla. out of all things. So while we're spending our winter, sort of tucked up with the snow, they're digging it out with mountain gorillas. I'm a bit, I'd love to be doing that. So the next step is then coming back. So this was literally just last month, early last month. KP and Talk again were back on the move and hitting across to what is the Guinea forests of this sort of western Africa, and they spend a lot of time there. Then 4 to 8 weeks again refueling, ready to do the big cross of the Sahara. So they're basically getting to a really good position, ready to do that crossing. And what's interesting is although they went down the east route on the way south, they're then looking to come back up the west route to come back north. So whereas with most species we envisage they follow the same route north and south, with cuckoos that doesn't work that way. They could do something different. And you have to remember that they haven't learnt this from anyone. They've never even met their parents. They've never, all this is complete instinct that they're going on. So but they're all doing similarly the same thing, which is quite astonishing. Whereas Cause was still back in the Congo Basin at this time. So he, obviously, having had that big, sort of trouble around sort of its southbound migration, has a really big effect on their northbound migration. So there's a really big correlation that the BTO found over the last 10 years that south, if they have trouble on the southbound, it really affects the timing of their northbound. So at this point, on the 12th of April, you can see here that this is linked up with all the other cuckoos as well from Britain, that Talk is heading off way ahead of the group, which is, interestingly, he was the first one to head off from breeding grounds. He was the first one to make the big Sahara crossing southbound, and now he's the first one to have made the Sahara crossing northbound. So it's really interesting that the same bird is doing this, is basically leading the pack all the way through. And as you can see there, Cause has finally moved out of the Congo Basin and is heading off towards West Africa. He's quite late, though, coming across, whereas all these others, the ones that are still marked there, they'd already been there for about 4 weeks, whereas he's literally just arriving there. Poor old George down there, unfortunately, he died in the Congo Basin. But yeah, so the rest of them are making their moves across. So as of the 23rd of April, which is when I finished writing this presentation, this is sort of the routes that they've taken. As you see, they've done this big route down the south side through the eastern side of Europe and down the Sahara, and they're heading back across. And as you can see, their Talk and KP are just on just entered into Spain, are making their way back, whereas Cause still has gone a little bit further west, but is basically doing a big feed up in Ghana. So this was 23rd of April, so just a few days ago. So where are they now? So I actually got an update this morning, and Cause has finally made the leap across the Sahara. He is currently just in central Algeria, so he's actually, if I go back to that, he's done a crossing. He's about here, so he's done something very different from these other two. He's going a lot further east again, so doing something quite different. He's actually almost going back to where he sort of made that initial crossing over. He's about there, whereas Talk has moved, and Talk is now into northern Spain. He's up on the border here. And KP is doing something very, very strange. He's actually coming out across the sea out here, out in the middle of the Bay of Biscay. So from this morning, he's literally just to the west of Brittany, out in the Atlantic. So we're wondering, is he going to keep going and go straight to Ireland and go, no, I'm not doing France, I'm not doing Britain, I'm just going to go straight back to Ireland, which would be really unusual and unexpected. But we'll have to wait and see, to be honest. So that's from this morning. So hopefully Cause will finish making this Sahara crossing. As I say, it's in central Algeria, about here, where there's a big mountain range with a series of oases. So he seems to know what he's doing. And then he'll head further north and head up. So that's where we are. So just a little bit about the future plan of this project. So obviously last year was the first year. This year I'm going on some training in Scotland to try and so that I'll be able to tag cuckoos myself. And then as from next year, we're going to start looking at trying to tag cuckoos in other parts of Ireland. Obviously, we had to start in Kerry, very important. But we're going to go to other parts of Ireland and see if there's any geographic difference in how some of these birds are moving. Because certainly, as far as their conservation, the south and east are very much has seen a greater decline than the north and west of the species. So there's far less in sort of around the Wicklow, Waterford, Wexford area. There's far less cuckoos there than there are in the north and west. So there could be that they're actually those ones are choosing different routes, which seems to be the case in Britain as well. So the Welsh and the Scottish birds all go the eastern route, whereas the majority of the English birds all go the western route, which is a lot harder and is a lot more troublesome for them in finding food. So, and that they've definitely seen very much more. The English population of cuckoo has declined a lot more than the Scottish and the Welsh. So we could be seeing something similar here. Obviously, that's going to take a lot longer to work that out. But it'll be a great way to start anyway. So just a quick last one, just to acknowledge all the people that have sort of helped amazingly with the starts of this project. So MPWS staff, mainly at Killarney, but also at the Burren and in our birds unit, and then BTO staff, some of which came over and got involved in helping us do the initial tagging, and then obviously, most importantly, Killarney National Park, who funded it, which was obviously the big important part, especially Danny O'Keefe, who believed in my crazy idea that this would be an amazing thing to do, and that the public would get very much behind it. And also to Valerie O'Sullivan. And most of those photos are Valerie's, which are absolutely amazing. She followed us in the early hours in the morning, dealing with everything to get some stunning photos of the project. So thank you very much.
Sam, thank you so much for that. Really, really interesting. So do cuckoos, they fly individually? They don't flock at all?
Not as far as we're aware, no. I mean, they seem to just have their own idea of what they're going to do and just go for it. It is a purely instinctive thing. They make their move, they go their way, and we're not sure exactly what triggers, which direction they go, how they do it. But it's assumed that there's something to do with how the populations have diversified, and that one's started going one way, and that's worked, and those came back again. But yeah, it's quite fascinating, a lot more to learn.
Thank you. I'm just going to get Niall Hatch from Birdwatch Ireland to have a bit of a chat, and we can include the audience as well, Niall. And listen, I know I landed that on you, so appreciate it.
Don't mind being landed on when it's things to do with birds. That's absolutely fine with me. Great. Thanks, Sam. That was absolutely phenomenal. It's really interesting to see where this may lead, and hopefully we'll see lots more results. Any idea yet how many more cuckoos, Irish cuckoos, will be tagged this year? Do you have a plan for that?
So we're not going to do any more this year.
Okay.
Because I've got to go off for the training. But certainly next year will be the start of, hopefully we'll be doing, ideal will be to do 4 a year. It's quite a process, and there's a very short window. So as you can imagine, the birds are only here for a short period of time. And what's really important is we want to get the birds that we know are breeding in a certain area, rather than just passing through. So April is basically they're just passing through. June, they're just passing through, going the other way. So you have this very short window in sort of the middle of May where there's a chance of doing that. So,
I noticed as well that obviously the three that we followed from the Irish population there were adult males.
Yes.
With cuckoos, there's quite a difference in the migration time, I understand, between the adult males, the adult females, and the juveniles. Are there plans in Ireland to also to tag ultimately adult females and juveniles? And do we know from the British results whether there's much of a difference in terms of the routes they take or the timings?
Well, at the moment, so the all of the birds that were tagged in, as part of the British project have all been adult males. And there's a main reason for that is that the tag, being 5 grams, although that is a very, very, very small weight, the males are quite a bit bigger than the females. So the females are quite a little bit smaller. And putting a tag that size, there's a very important threshold limit where you don't want to put something too heavy on a bird, which is potentially going to affect it in any way. So 5 grams, it sounds small for, but it's very important that we don't go over a certain size to make sure that, well, otherwise the data would be useless for starters, and obviously you'd be affecting the birds, which you wouldn't want to do. So at the moment, they've only been doing adult males, which is what we've been doing. Now, there is a plan which hopefully might be starting this year that the BTO are looking to use a different type of tag, potentially for females, but it won't be like a live feed tag. It will work off a mobile phone network. So the idea will be they'll get plenty of feedback while they're in Europe, but once they get into Africa where there's no mobile phone network at all, you'll have to wait for them to get back to Europe, and then there'll be a big download of data as to where they've been. So it won't quite be, sort of the same, and potentially you could lose some en route, which you wouldn't know where they're gone. So, but they're a lot lighter. And obviously all this has to go through very, very strict, bird welfare protocols, and there's a big committee that sits over these to make sure that anything we're doing, because a lot of this is new technology, new stuff, hasn't been used on a species like this before, so it has to be really, really important that it gets done properly.
I'm interested, are you aware of any other studies in other countries across the range of the cuckoo? It has a huge breeding range all across most of Europe and Asia.
Yeah.
Are they being tracked in other populations
Yeah,
too?
yeah. So the BTO started off in the UK, and then there's been various other ones in Belarus, Germany, and I think they did a few in Lithuania as well. There's been a little bit of a project started in France, but then they also did some in China, right out in Kamchatka, right in the far, 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 far east as you can go in Russia. And they found that all of those birds all came back to Africa. So even from as far, far east, they all tracked back to Africa, and pretty much to that same area within the Congo Basin. The Kamchatka ones seem to be very much the east end of that basin, whereas our ones are a bit more the west end of that basin. But yeah, it was amazing, this complete fan of this species which goes across, which is why the BTO were really keen to get some Irish data, because it's as far west as the species go. So it's a really good way of pulling it all together. So very exciting, yeah.
I imagine that the cuckoo is a species that it stands to reason is probably quite significantly affected by climate change, and that could really be posing a threat to it.
Yeah.
I presume that's a major factor in this research as well.
Yeah, exactly. So the research that the BTO are doing is obviously it's the initial tracking where they're going, but they're looking at things like weather effects, the rainfall levels. They're looking at different atmospheric pressures and stuff going on across their migration routes. So as we know, the Sahara is getting bigger every year. It's getting more of the crossing is harder. A lot of the oases are drying up that previously were there. So some of these birds might be turning up in locations where previously there was something they could feed on, and then there's nothing anymore. So yeah, there's lots of different effects going on. And they're still doing masses of different sort of studies on the data even sort of years later. So but as I say, they're going to start looking at the females hopefully this year. Juveniles is a tricky one, because the mortality of juveniles is really high. So a lot of them just don't survive that first migration. So each tag is very expensive, and you want to get good. You want to get a good amount of data. So putting it on juveniles at the moment would seem a little bit preemptive. We want to find out more about the adults first, and then eventually, potentially, the juveniles might be something further down the line.
I'm curious, you talked about catching the cuckoos and an early start and the training that's involved. How else is it done? How do you actually get them to go into the nets, I presume?
Yeah, so being in the dark helps because it makes it harder for them to see the nets. But we do play like a recording of a cuckoo, which sort of draws them in. But actually, that one morning on Killarney, we ended up with all three of those male cuckoos in the net at once. We had sort of 3 nets in a triangle, and one went in at each different angle. So it was very quick and very simple. Once we tag them, release them, that's it. And of course, we don't have to touch them again, which is brilliant about when you're doing this sort of technology. Whereas when you're just ringing a bird, it's still good information, but to get more information, you have to catch it again and catch it again and catch it again and catch it again. So whereas with this, that's it, one touch, and then they're off and doing their own thing. So very cool.
Oh, fantastic. I suppose we could open up to questions from the floor. If there's anything they'd like to ask Sam.
Just one question. What does the female cuckoo do while the male pipit is feeding her chick?
So the female cuckoo, she will lay about 10 eggs, and each egg will be in a separate nest. And once she's finished laying her eggs, she goes. She migrates. Once she's finished, she just disappears off, and that's it. It's like your self-made nursery in a way. So they have no involvement whatsoever. And actually, the females have developed quite a cunning. So the males, you see like this, they're very much this grey with this black barring on them. Whereas the females, actually, you can get 2 different forms of females. You get a grey version and a sort of a brown version. And the brown version is thought to be a fairly recent adaptation in the last sort of few thousand years, where they are developing, they're starting to basically be able to hide themselves better. So when they do go in and lay their egg in a nest, it's harder for the parents of the meadow pipit or whatever to see them doing it, and they literally just pop in, lay an egg, and straight back out again. It's like seconds and gone. She has 10 eggs, but they'll be in different nests. So one egg in each nest, and that'll be it. Yeah. How long do cuckoos live? They average about 6 or so years. But I think the oldest known was about 10 years, 10, 12 years. So, but again, there's not a great deal of research yet. Not a great deal is done. So we're probably learning more about how long they live. And obviously, so these guys were all ringed as adults. So they could already be 10 years old, or they could be 2 years old. We're not sure. So, hopefully they're on the 2-year-old, and then we'll get lots more information. But it's difficult to know until we'll see what happens.
Let's go to the gentleman in the front row here.
Sam, thank you. That's a brilliant presentation there. Brilliant. Just an obvious question. Is it the male or the female who makes the cuckoo sound?
Yeah, so
or do they both?
Yeah, it's only the male that makes the cuckoo noise. It's only the male that does that. The female has a very different call. She does call, but it's like this bubbling, chirruping, very much like something you'd imagine from the jungles of Africa, to be honest. I haven't got a recording of it here, but you'll find if you Google female cuckoo call, you'll find it very easily, and it is something quite different. We don't hear it that much in Ireland. You do hear it, but it's sort of like this gurgling, bubbling noise, which you wouldn't think, oh, that's a cuckoo. It's very different indeed.
And just connected to that, when they go to Africa, did they change their calls? Do you hear that cuckoo? Is that like a mating call that we only hear?
From what I believe, so some of the BTO researchers did go to Africa, to the Congo, to try and see if they could find some of the birds there, just to get more of an idea of what habitat they're in. And seemingly in Africa, they pretty much don't make any noise at all. It's as you say, it is much more a display, breeding, sort of thing. So. We hear the cuckoo here, but you won't hear it there. So
that's good for us, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Gentleman beside you there.
Thanks, Sam. Is there any variation in the species, like the cuckoo coming from Kamchatka compared to the Burren?
species? The variation in.
within the cuckoo population, like are they all pretty much coming from the same? Is there any subspecies of them? Do they vary a lot?
Not really. No.
Behavior or
No, the behaviour is pretty much exactly the same. There's not a lot different going on there at all. They will have different species that they lay their eggs in. Obviously, you don't have meadowpipits over in Kamchatka. You don't have, even it's different even when you go to Britain. So in Britain, one of the main species they lay eggs in is reed warblers. You go to certainly into in England, but reed warblers are expanding massively across Ireland now, which they never used to be. But we're pretty certain that reed warblers aren't being used here because they never have been in the past. So the females that are coming back here, they don't know what a reed warbler is. They're looking for their own species that they came out of. So it's quite an interesting dynamic. So even in Wales, cuckoos don't use reed warblers, which is even just across the just next door to England. So and then but you'll get different. It'll be completely different stuff if you go to China and sort of Eastern Russia and stuff like that. So.
I know there's a population, I think, in Finland and just over the border into Russia that specialises in redstart now, so they go for the redstarts.
Yeah.
And I guess the ones in East Asia, there's other species of cuckoo you have out there as well that look very similar, so they might have more competition. Who knows? It's really fascinating.
Yeah. So you've got the Oriental cuckoo, which is only recently sort of seen as a separate species, but they migrate down to Australia instead. So they, but you get they're all in sort of that same area as our eastern common cuckoo. That comes across to Africa. It's the same. You have the Oriental cuckoo in that same area, but goes down to Australia. So very interesting. Yeah.
Any other questions? I saw some hands up around the room there. Yes, gentleman over here.
Thanks, Sam. That was great. Can you tell from the data at what elevation these birds are flying at?
There is some in the deep data, which I haven't dived into yet. From what I gather, there is a bit more information on that. We haven't gone there yet. There's a lot more to go on, but certainly, I mean, in the Congo, we know that it's high elevation there anyway, and a lot of their route across. They were crossing the Alps, crossing the Pyrenees, so they're not afraid of going over high areas at all. And I would imagine that probably KP that's crossing the Bay of Biscay as we currently speak is who knows? We'll have to look into that data when it comes back. But I say this is very early starts of this project, that's something we'll definitely be looking into.
Thanks, Sam. That was amazing. Can I just ask, is there an ability of the public to track these online? Is the feed live online?
Yeah. So there's BTO run a blog for each individual cuckoo, so which give updates of where they are and what they're doing and how they're moving, and gives a really great sort of description of the habitat they're in and the areas that they're using. You can go to the website, go to the BTO website. And you can follow the cuckoo tracking project, and you'll find the birds all on there. Or there is a link through the Killarney National Park Facebook website. Sorry, the Killarney National Park website. There is a link on there through the tracking project too. So it is brilliant, and it's brought a lot of people along with it. So,
any other questions? Anything you'd like Sam to address? Yep.
I was the one, I think it was Coors that went up and. Up the middle kind of Africa. You recorded it on the 23rd, and on the 28th, which was this morning, it had travelled an enormous distance.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, when they're flying, are they beating their wings the whole time? Do they take breaks? And how much do they cover in a day?
So so the whole journey going from so the whole return trip is about 9,000 kilometres. It's quite a journey. But when they do those big crossings, they're pretty much non-stop. They just keep going, and it is flapping. It is wing beating. They will use a certain amount of thermals to a degree, but they're not a bird that soars or does it. It's wing beats. It's going, which is why they have to have those huge refueling points so that they can keep on going. So it very much is a solid wing beat motion. Yeah, it is incredible. It is quite amazing. Yeah.
Anyone else?
would they be aware of if a storm coming, say, would they stop and not go and wait a couple of days, or would they?
From what we gather, yes. So they will wait for, for one, they need obviously to be physically able, so they need to have built up their fuel. But yeah, they will wait for decent migration, weather. If there is really bad weather, they would hold back and wait. And we see that with other species of birds as well. You often get suddenly there'll be a stall in migration, and then they'll all go again. So as long as that storm is brief, they'll wait. If it's long, they'll probably then take their chances and start going through it, because they don't want to miss that window, especially on the Northbound coming back to breeding grounds. It's very important that they get back there in good time. Although these guys haven't arrived back yet, there's quite a few people have already seen cuckoos in Ireland already this year. You do get this sort of like an early wave of birds that come in, but it does seem that all the tagged birds over the years all seem to be within the birds that arrive en masse, sort of usually very end of April, beginning of May. So that's which is the core arrival of the cuckoo. You always get a few that turn up early, and always a few that then leave late as well. But the vast majority are in that middle range.
A few years ago, we had Eric Dempsey down to give a talk, and we went just out here. We went along towards the diving boards, if anybody is familiar with that area. And the first bird we saw was a meadow pipit. It was just sitting on the wire. So he pointed at the meadow pipit. He said, meadow pipit numbers are in decline, and consequently cuckoo numbers were in decline. So there was that association between two birds there that were both in decline, and just had a big impact. And as we went along the walk, it was just one story after another about all these things are threatened. Have you any ideas about how we can just get that message out there that a lot of things are hurting at the moment and need our help?
I suppose it's just keep telling it. I think is the sort of events like this, any sort of talking to people, so informally is usually. It's amazing how informal stuff works so well, because it's like often with events like this, it's brilliant, but you're often like preaching to the converted in a way. So everyone's very keen on wildlife in this room, I'm sure, which is why we're here today. But then sort of sometimes talking to people that don't know about it, or it's just not something that's come into their sphere. That can be far more helpful, far more interesting, far more a way of sort of spreading the message. I do go on about things like that quite often.
I was going to say that, Sam.
Yeah.
Well, listen, Sam, we could stay here for ages, and it's been an absolute pleasure to have you tell us the story of the cuckoo.
Yeah.
So
I hope you're able to follow them as they keep going over the next, hopefully, few years.
Cool. We look forward to it.
Yeah.
Thanks a million.
No problem at all.